Chapter 14, Ethnic Studies Changes the Key. In this chapter, we'll learn about ethnicity and the literary canon, double consciousness and identity, writing yourself into the social narrative, the psychological function of others, figurative language's centrality, and border identities. "That's funny, I hear it like this," says one musician to another, before beginning to play. "You could say that writers create or perform after getting a sense of what they want to say. I hear it like this in my head, now let's get it on paper." Writers, as well as readers and critics, often improvise with texts, emphasizing what they see in them and filling in what they don't see but know to be true. The field of ethnic studies offers a look at how literature itself reads, revises, and creates. The widely varying critics in this field share a view of texts, cultural traditions, identity, and community as dynamic compositions filled with the challenges and opportunities of interpretation. Are you what you read? One of the most important consequences of ethnic theory and criticism has been the transformation of the literary canon. When you look at bookstores, classrooms, and reading groups these days, you see things that didn't exist for earlier generations, and not just because some of the bookstores are now electronic. Who chooses what you read? Why, you do, of course. But you also get a lot of help in choosing. There are books you're supposed to read in school, there may be books you need to read for work, and there are books you might want to read to keep up with what's popular. Then there's access. What's easy to get? You'd think these days you can find anything, and you can, but only if you go looking for it. Otherwise, what you find easily accessible is what someone else has decided is worth putting in your way, or what someone simply wants to sell you. In both cases, you can thank literary theory and criticism for much of the positive change that has occurred over the past few decades. And thank Oprah, too. Students are still assigned works by many of the dead white European males that used to monopolize reading lists. But those students are now likely to be assigned books by Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, or Amy Tan, alongside those by Charles Dickens or John Milton. Similarly, publishers recognize the value and popularity of books published by writers who, taken together, look a lot more like actual society than used to be the case. What all this means is that the canon, the stated or implied collection of texts you're supposed to read, is now radically changed. In previous chapters of this book, we've seen how intimately connected reading is to cultural, political, and personal identity. For most literary critics, change in the canon means change in the way we see ourselves and our societies. Literature both represents the world's exploration of itself and contributes to it. In addition, when the canon changes, everything in it looks slightly, or even significantly, different. That is, any single work gathers its full meaning through its relationship with the other works. You think of what you've read before. You make comparisons, you discover precedents to works you once thought of as totally unique. Those dead white European males, for example, many of whom really did write tremendous works, get reread in new ways, not only when new readers get to them, but when they are considered in the light of other readings. Likewise, all those new or rediscovered works previously absent from the canon spur writers to think and create in new ways as well. National sensations. In whatever shape, a literary canon is often seen as a reflection of national culture. The logic, of course, is that each nation should have its own culture. The problem, as we'll see in chapters 19 and 21, is that people do not always agree on what national culture means. Many people see a nation's culture as the broad collection of a country's actual cultural practices. Some, however, see culture as kind of a goal or ideal. Culture is seen to reflect the best of a nation's cultural products, often drawn from the past. Ethnic studies has influenced both of these views in recent decades, and one measure of these changes can be seen in literary anthologies. Current anthologies of national literature have both expanded the range of included items, which changes the family portrait view of a country's culture, and confirmed the value of previously non-canonical works as part of the nation's high culture. There are dozens of other issues at stake, and we're not going to cover them all, but consider some of the questions that anthology editors have to ask. As people keep writing, and they never stop, which authors get included in new anthologies and which are left out? Does the national literature all have to be written in the same language? Works of American, Canadian, or French literature, for example, have always been written in multiple languages. What about those national boundaries anyway? Does French literature stop with the borders of France, or should it include works written in French by writers from other countries? And what's with English literature? Does that mean literature in English, or literature from England? Should it be British literature, in order to include works from the other countries of the United Kingdom in addition to England? Our discussion in this chapter focuses mainly on responses to questions about national identity in American literature. Chapter 21's discussion of colonial literature expands the discussion to a more global scale. And in the American context, of course, questions about national identity have been played out, in life as in literature, largely in the context of race. Please check one of the boxes. Literary and cultural critics point out that while it's clear that the category of race has no actual biological basis, it's still one of the most potent forces in culture and politics. That is, viewing race as a biologically determined quality that divides the human species is unsupportable. Yet recognizing race as ideological, as a social interpretation of difference, reminds us of the enormous power that social fictions wield. As the title of an important work by Cornel West puts it, race matters. You may know the feeling of looking at the choices on a census or from a college application, asking you to check one of the boxes for race or ethnicity. You look at the choices and you know that they're just categories, while you're a whole person. Still, you have to choose a box. And besides, there's power in those boxes as well, since decisions are made based on the categories offered. Changes to census forms, for example, are fiercely debated, since they affect the representation and funding that communities receive. Checking a box, therefore, is a weird combination of self-identification, ethnic solidarity, and economic involvement. It's personal and political at the same time. And what's particularly remarkable about literature is the way it can explore the intersections between your own view of self, family, community, and nation, and the view provided by the social fictions about those same categories. American autograph. African American literature has been around as long as America has been around, but it certainly hasn't always been made to seem that way. In the 20th century, African American literary theory drew on this very long history, and then, crucially, made that history visible. The early history of African American literature illustrates how an individual's views of the self can be shaped and misshaped by social views and prejudices. Yet the same history shows how individual efforts of creating literature also become collective gestures that would ultimately change how American literature and society were defined. During the long history of slavery in the United States, it was understood by most of white society that African Americans had no written voice at all. Slaves were generally denied literacy outright, and the question of African American participation in the written testament of national identity was, in the minds of most Americans, closed. But of course, not everyone agreed. Right makes might. Phyllis Wheatley, circa 1753 to 1784, a slave born in West Africa and living in Boston during the period of the American Revolution, not only learned to read and write in English, but published a volume of poetry in 1773. Her remarkable achievement, according to Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Nellie Y. McKay, was not only to produce literature, but to write her way into American literature. And despite Thomas Jefferson's infamous remark that her work was below the dignity of criticism, Wheatley's volume stood as a clear signal of an African American literary presence even before the country declared its independence. One literary genre that received enormous attention between independence and the end of the Civil War in 1865 was the genre of the slave narrative. During this period, over 100 accounts of slavery were published. By 1944, over 6,000 ex-slaves had woven their stories into what Gates calls the very foundation upon which most subsequent Afro-American fictional and non-fictional narrative forms are based. The most famous of the American slave narratives is that of Frederick Douglass, circa 1818 to 1895. First published in 1845, the book's full title is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. This last part is important, written by himself. Why put that in the title? Because at the time, many people simply could not accept that African Americans were capable of writing their own stories. They assumed or charged that the narratives were written by white authors, since, to their minds, the reality of black authorship would unsettle an entire worldview. Beginning with Wheatley's volume, in fact, a tradition arose of having white publishers, writers, or abolitionists attest to a book's African American authorship. It was not enough for the African American writers themselves to simply claim authorship. Critics have pointed out that this interracial literary etiquette, as Gates called it, was an important aspect of African American literary history. Basically, it highlights the fact that African American writing developed against the assumption that it shouldn't even exist. Douglass's narrative, and other slave narratives, therefore, took the form of autobiography, a form of literature typically associated with men of high standing. See Chapter 12's discussion of Mary Shelley's feminist appropriation of this genre as well. If Benjamin Franklin had something to offer readers by publishing an autobiography, then so did Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. In fact, autobiography has a way of showing how individual lives are part of national lives, and these American examples were no exceptions. Simply put, the story of American culture included the voices of slavery. In their various ways, the slave narratives also offered lessons on how to hear the voices that comprised them. Like a literary critic, in fact, Douglass explained how songs, conversations, and writings had to be understood with respect to the specific context of slavery's oppression. For example, Douglass described his astonishment at hearing white people claim that since they heard slaves singing, this must be evidence of their contentment and happiness. Douglass explained that there is much, much more to the story. A song's motivations may come from the deepest despair and yet sound rapturous, while other songs might sound pathetic and yet be filled with a joyful message. Even ordinary communication, for Douglass, was a complex process under the conditions of slavery. Using language to communicate means involving yourself in the written and unwritten rules of culture, politics, and even the human mind itself. In the context of slavery, conversation often demanded a coding system, so that slaves could understand each other while the slave owners were kept ignorant of what was really going on. Douglass's narrative describes how fatal telling the simple truth could be, and how slaves developed forms of speaking and writing whose codes, levels, and misdirections would shape the development of much African American literature to come. Following the Civil War, the prolific sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, pronounced Du Bois, wrote essays and articles about virtually everything concerned with America's struggles with racial identity. In 1903, he published The Souls of Black Folk, and explained to anyone who would listen that race was a matter of culture, not nature or biology. In particular, Du Bois argued that African Americans living in a racialized society developed a double consciousness. Du Bois explained that this double consciousness is no true self-consciousness, but the experience of seeing yourself through the eyes of white America. For Du Bois, the goal was not the separatism that would be argued by some later critics, but a blending of the two struggling sides in order to merge his double self into a better and truer self. Understanding the Black American self, for Du Bois, was not simply a matter of clearing out the presence of white America, but of establishing the conditions for an entirely genuine Black self that could freely emerge in American culture. It simply wasn't possible, Du Bois argued, for Americans, Black or white, to understand themselves without tearing away the veil that separated their worlds. Du Bois explained that politically, culturally, and psychologically, he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American. Literary theory and criticism will see this concept of double consciousness, or hybridity, emerge time and time again in a variety of situations. Du Bois's linking of it to social development associates his critique with feminist approaches and sets the stage for much post-colonial theory to come. See Chapter 21. Yet despite the connection to feminist theory in principle, critics have pointed out that Du Bois's arguments tend, like many did throughout the 20th century, to privilege men at the expense of women. In discussions of race in America, questions of black and white have often been limited to matters of black men and white men. We've seen this move before, whereby a so-called universal situation obscures a more specific actual focus. In the case of African American literary and cultural theory, critics have pointed out how important it is to recognize issues of race that were specific to women's experience. As we saw in our discussion of feminist criticism in Chapter 12, patriarchy can be an unwelcome aspect of even the most progressive struggles for social liberation. Modern subjects. As the Black American canon began to emerge, it did not always reflect the women who had contributed to the changing terrain of American literature. Similarly, as the early feminist movement developed in the early 1900s, African American women were often overlooked in the process of creating an image of the so-called new woman. Black women writers, therefore, sometimes found themselves fighting against resistance on two sides. The critic Deborah E. McDowell has argued that writing about Black female sexuality was complicated by a literary era that often sensationalized it in primitive and exotic stereotypes. On the other side, McDowell pointed out, African American women were excluded from literary images of the cult of true womanhood, which set out the ideals of the modern domestic woman, rather like the angel in the house. In spite of these challenges, the 1920s and 1930s saw two women in particular who were instrumental in changing the image of American national identity through their literature, although they would both receive full recognition for their achievements only years after their deaths. That period was also known as the Harlem Renaissance, because of the flourishing of African American literature and arts in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. Nella Larsen, 1891 to 1964, was the author of two important novels. Quicksand was published in 1928 and reviewed very favorably by Du Bois. Larsen's second novel, Passing, appeared in 1929, after which her writing career quickly began to fade out. Zora Neale Hurston, 1891 to 1960, was an anthropologist, author, playwright, and co-founder of a literary magazine. Hurston's work in preserving African American folklore, including her book, Mules and Men, 1935, has been invaluable for generations of scholars and fascinating for any reader. But Hurston is probably most well known today for her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937. In fact, it was Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, 1982, who brought Hurston's work back from obscurity and in 1973 even tracked down Hurston's unmarked grave and provided it with a headstone. In many such instances, literary criticism has played an important role since the 1970s in recovering neglected African American texts, including those by Larsen and Hurston. Several male African American writers from the Harlem Renaissance to the 1950s also established many of the terms for debate in literary criticism. The poet Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967, favored depictions of the working class and promoted the legitimacy of racial art that did not try to gloss over the realities of African American lives. Hughes wrote simply, "We know we are beautiful, and ugly too." Richard Wright, 1908 to 1960, wrote fiction and essays and is most famous for his novel Native Son, 1940, his story collection Uncle Tom's Children, 1938, and his autobiography Black Boy, the first part of which was published in 1945 and the second part published posthumously in 1977. Wright was a fierce advocate of Marxism, associated with the writers of the Negritude movement, and was celebrated both during his life and by writers of the 1960s as a premier writer of protest fiction. On the other hand, James Baldwin, 1924 to 1987, argued that protest literature such as Wright's works, and even Harriet Beecher Stowe's classic Uncle Tom's Cabin, were actually doing more harm than good for African Americans. He argued that protest novels too often reduced Black culture to images of simplistic degradation and victimization. Not only that, but they tended to elicit mere sympathy because of their sensationalism, while real change required more than provoking the reader's emotion. For this reason, Baldwin's nonfiction essays tended to address protest themes and explore specific issues of race and politics, while his novels explored more personal and cultural issues, including his own homosexuality. Novelist, critic, and essayist Ralph Ellison, 1914 to 1994, famously asked, "Why is it that so many of those who would tell us the meaning of Negro life never bother to learn how varied it really is?" Ellison's classic novel Invisible Man, 1952, as well as his other works of fiction and nonfiction, explore the diverse facets of African American experience, from the very good to the deeply troubling. Some critics claimed Ellison's Invisible Man was a betrayal of its African American origins, since it did not promote the Marxist agenda promoted by other writers, and it viewed Black nationalism with skepticism. Most critics, therefore, have come to see this remarkable novel as a quintessentially American exploration of double consciousness and the nature of identity in a multi-ethnic nation. Critic Theodore O. Mason Jr. said that Ellison's philosophy of the novel form was that it refuses to provide specific answers, but instead is an arena for speculation, for investigation, for a complex mediation on the informing social conflict of the day. In the 1960s, writers, artists, and critics of the Black arts movement emphasized the instrumental nature of art. That is, they saw art as a tool for social change. Literary criticism of this period tended to be evaluative and concerned with promoting works seen as most useful for African American interests. This is also the period that saw significant changes in colleges and universities, particularly in the addition of departments of African and African American studies. Key figures in the Black arts movement included Amiri Baraka, formerly known as Leroy Jones, Malcolm X, 1925 to 1965, the feminist critic Audre Lorde, 1934 to 1992, Ishmael Reed, and Nikki Giovanni. Theory turns. Beginning in the 1980s, along with the general emphasis on theory that characterized literary study, African American theory developed into a fascinating and complex field. The critic Bell Hooks, and yes, her name is spelled in lowercase, emphasized that theory was not just a set of abstractions about literature, nor was it a rule book for writers. Instead, she argued that theory was an essential aspect of social practice. Hooks showed, for example, that lives and institutions can be forced to change when theory reveals the flawed logic and ulterior motives behind racism and patriarchy. Reading like a writer. You're probably familiar with Toni Morrison, the author of such novels as Sula, 1974, Song of Solomon, 1977, and Beloved, 1987. In 1992, Morrison, who in addition to being a novelist is also a playwright and essayist, published a very influential book, based on a series of lectures, called Playing in the Dark. Among the interesting points that Morrison made in these lectures, one in particular has seemed to resonate with critics, novelists, and ordinary readers alike. It's Morrison's discussion of how the presence of Africa and African Americanism can be felt throughout all American literature. Morrison begins by explaining how common it used to be, and still can be, to ignore African American voices in American literature, particularly by professors who claim not to specialize in African American literature. What's Black about Edgar Allan Poe, for example, or Henry James, Willa Cather, or Ernest Hemingway? For Black America, you go to African American literature, so goes the argument. Morrison explained that even she felt this way, until she began to read like a writer. What Morrison meant is that when writers create their fictional worlds, these worlds will always reflect the writer's consciousness, and for most American writers, white or black, that consciousness is shaped by its encounter with racial ideology. Anytime an African or African American character or issue arises in a white text, Morrison sees it as integral to the consciousness of the story, not just local color or incidental detail that merely provides a sense of realism. As Morrison put it, as a writer reading, I came to realize the obvious. The subject of the dream is the dreamer. As a critical reader, Morrison wanted to examine the function of what she called the Africanist presence in much of American literature. And this function, according to Morrison, is often deeply psychological. Writers use or struggle with the Africanist presence in their works in order to work out psychological issues. See Chapter 10 for more on the Freudian basis of this. As an example, Morrison considered Willa Cather's novel, Sapphira and the Slave Girl. Morrison pointed out that critics have viewed this novel as flawed and uneven, yet Morrison's own reading shows that the so-called flaws are evidence of Cather struggling with telling a story about a white woman and a slave, yet being unable to clearly separate the two characters' dependence on each other. Cather's novel sets out to tell two stories, yet reveals Sapphira's psychological use of the slave girl to construct Sapphira's own identity and the novelist's own use of the story to meditate on the ironic moral equivalence of slave and slave owner. Another major critic, Hortense Spillers, wrote in 1987, "My country needs me, and if I were not here, I would have to be invented." By this, Spillers meant something similar to Morrison's point, which is that the Africanist presence is essential to understanding American literature as such, and understanding American literary criticism as well. Other critics also push the boundaries of existing theory, often by bringing feminist theory into contact with African American interests. Hazel Carby, for example, suggested that it's better to think of the very category of Black feminist criticism as a problem, not a solution. And she meant this in a productive way, since just calling something Black feminist criticism won't solve conflicts between Black and feminist interests. Instead, such a field should explore the varied nature of actual writing and reading experiences. Barbara Smith in 1979 and later Deborah McDowell both called on critics to turn their attention to the specifically Black writing practices of women, rather than the lives of women writers themselves. Investigating Black women's distinctive use of literary techniques would lead to a better understanding of how these writers have created a specific literary language and tradition. Well, that figures. And speaking of the creation of a specific literary language and tradition brings us again to Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Gates' groundbreaking study, The Signifying Monkey, A Theory of African American Literary Criticism, appeared in 1988. This book brought anthropology and structuralism, see Chapter 16, along with deconstruction, see Chapter 17, into a dialogue with African American studies. Gates' central interest was to trace a literary tradition specific to Black writers, which forms the basis of African American writing. And it isn't a tradition that spins off from the Western tradition. It's a true alternative or parallel literary tradition derived from the unique experiences of African and African American people. This tradition is based on the idea of signifying, which Gates spelled signifying, in order to 1. Distinguish the word from its use in white signification, and 2. Indicate that this word is, more often than not, spoken by Black people without the final G as signifying. So what's white signification? It's the process we've generally discussed in this book, Chapter 11 Survey of Saussure, whereby meaning is created through your use of signs. You simply get your point across by using language. Gates argued that an alternative African and African American tradition has always emphasized that simply getting your point across is not what language is always about. Instead, signifying language is all about interruption, playful ambiguity, and talking around a subject, often to confuse someone. Why do this? Gates explained that language use, in the signifying tradition, is a process of both protection and of artistic creativity. Protection, because in a situation where you are at a disadvantage, talking indirectly and with misdirection as your goal might help you survive. In fact, the image of the signifying monkey comes from African folk tales of a monkey staying one step ahead of much stronger animals by virtue of his clever use of language. And creativity, because the very tools that white signifying sees as extras or add-ons to regular language, signifying recognizes as the very heart of human literary creation. That is, in the white signifying tradition, tropes like metaphor, rhyme, hyperbole, and irony, which Gates called the master tropes, are set to the side of real instrumental language. These tropes are examples of figurative language, not literal language. As Jacques Derrida has shown, however, see Chapter 17, even the most literal of literal language is essentially figurative. Gates argued that the Africanist signifying tradition has long recognized this, so that his theory gives tropes a central, rather than a marginal, role in language use. Gates's study showed how signifying, which is a rhetorical act that is not engaged in the game of information giving, has historically ranged from the childishly humorous to the profoundly sophisticated. For example, a word game like The Dozens, with its insults particularly directed at someone's mother, is a ritual of signifying. Here, the creation and escalation of insults tests a kid's creativity as well as his or her ability to remain above it all and treat the utterances as part of a game. Much jazz music also offers opportunities for signifying. Gates called attention to this as formal parody, meaning that the musicians exploit the form of whatever music they are playing in ways that repeat with a difference. The music may be set out one way, as white signification would have it, but the musicians hear it another way and play a new form into existence. In his reading of Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, Gates sees Hurston's text signifying on earlier African American works by claiming an oral quality to the written text and a textual quality to the dialogue spoken by characters. That is, Hurston's novel, according to Gates, weaves together the direct speech of the African American vernacular and the presumably authoritative narrator's voice in a way that doesn't privilege either side, but instead shows that a special signifying African American voice controls the whole show. Borders and belongings. Borders interrupt, complicate, and create ethnic identity everywhere in the world. From his perspective, critic Ramon Salvidar explains that positioned between cultures, living on borderlines, Chicanos and other narratives have assumed a unique borderland quality, reflecting in no uncertain terms the forms and styles of their folk-based origins. Latino and Latina, sometimes written as Latino/A, critics and writers have developed literary approaches that often emphasize the maintenance of folk or indigenous cultures. The broad collection of voices ranging throughout the ethnicities of the New World also includes critics who embrace the creation of new identities fashioned by and against borders. The creation of new identities fashioned by and against borders. Gloria Anzaldúa, 1942 to 2004, explored a remarkable mode of self-construction in her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, 1987. This fascinating book, filled with poetry, prose sketches, criticism, songs, and sayings, also combines several different languages, including English, several distinct dialects of Spanish, Spanglish, and Nahuatl. The form of Anzaldúa's book reflects the book's theme. Identity for Anzaldúa is always prompted by existing identities and traditions, yet the result is entirely new. Anzaldúa described the various identities that had been imposed on her and showed how she transformed such impositions into an identity reflecting her own intrinsic nature. What's particularly interesting about her book, and has made it so influential, not only to people living on American borders, but on borders around the world, is that Anzaldúa sensitively linked the lived reality of her identity to language and literature. Anzaldúa did not view writing as merely a means of representation or even expression. Instead, she saw writing as active agent in the creation of new composite, mestiza, identity, and more importantly, new forms of solidarity as well. Meanwhile, in many Asian American novels, according to critic Lisa Lowe, the question of the loss or transmission of the original culture is frequently represented in a family narrative, figured as generational conflict between the Chinese-born first generation and the American-born second generation. In this regard, you might be familiar with such novels as Louis Chu's Eat a Bowl of Tea, 1961, Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, 1975, and Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, 1989. If not, check them out. Then keep in mind that Lowe actually argued for a somewhat different approach to reading them. According to Lowe, focusing only on generational issues in these novels leads to an essentialist view of Asian Americans and the issues they face. Problems and themes simply seem to be handed down naturally from one generation to the next. Lowe advocated focusing on the horizontal relationships between friends or siblings instead of vertical relationships between the generations. In any of the preceding novels mentioned, this critical approach would reveal, according to Lowe, a more extensive view of actual ethnic issues, since you're looking into how people in the same ethnic group, and of the same age, feel about and define themselves. The development of the American literary canon has also been expanded to include Native American texts, such as the bestsellers House Made of Dawn by Anne Scott Momaday, 1968, and Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, 1977. Critics of Native American literature, including Gerald Weisner, Arnold Krupat, Robert Dale Parker, and Carlton Smith, have emphasized the importance of oral storytelling and the spiritual importance of the earth for indigenous writers. In fact, Arnold Krupat has emphasized that critics of indigenous literature should be grounded in the animate and sentient earth. In Chapter 22, we'll see how eco-criticism even moves beyond the borders of human society emphasized by ethnic studies. The least you need to know. Ethnicity both shapes and challenges national identity. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness set many of the terms of debate for African American literary history. Literature has the power to shape individual and national identity. An Africanist presence functions in significant ways in most American literature. Signifying is language use that emphasizes figurative language and literary parody. Ethnic studies recognizes the importance of physical and cultural borders in the development of literary criticism.